Lowkey is the renowned hip-hop artist formerly referred to and is the host of the Watchdog podcast, as well as being a professorial and powerful political campaigner. He joins me now. Lowkey, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. You appeal very greatly to young people. I've seen them queuing in their hundreds outside theatres to come and hear you, see you. How do you think the idea of conscription at the age of 18 is going to feel to them?
Thank you for having me, George. It's wonderful to be with you. Well, the simple fact is this: the British political elite and military system is attempting to try and integrate young people into their war games in aid of US imperialism around the world. It has failed to inculcate these young people with the talking points of the military elite. It has failed to sell and manufacture consent for the wars around the world. And actually, year by year, the British Army is losing about 15,000 troops because people no longer want to join this military system. They do not view the wars as just, and they do not view themselves as protecting the people that need it and vulnerable people around the world. So therefore, this latest attempt to integrate people into that structure, I believe, will ultimately fail.
I'll organise, I'm sure that you'll be with me as one of the co-founders of No to NATO, No to War, a mass campaign of civil disobedience against this plan, if it comes to pass, you think would be successful?
Absolutely. When speaking to people on a daily basis, all of them looked at the idea of conscription. You know, at the moment, we essentially have a form of financial conscription where our taxes go towards a Ministry of Defense that was involved in the fourth British occupation of Afghanistan in 2 centuries. It was involved in the great calamity, the great crime against humanity, which was the occupation of Iraq. And actually, the British have been involved in at least 7 covert wars over the last decade or so, from Libya to Syria to Yemen, even to Pakistan. They've had involvement. And this is something that ultimately the great majority of the population, I believe, would not support if they knew the full details of it. So I think any movement of civil disobedience would likely cause great damage to the efforts of the government.
Now, the British general election is off and running, well, stumbling, crawling. I don't know how you'd put it. You're more lyrical than I. What's your impression so far of the Donkey Derby?
Well, you know, I have to remember the words of my favorite Pankhurst, Sylvia Pankhurst, the anti-war and suffragettes hero who, in the midst of World War I, stood against the push by her own family members towards that horrific mass killing of over 20 million people. She had great foresight to see that it was wrong and was willing to go to jail for her convictions about that. But she once said to Vladimir Lenin, as the story goes, "If we are real revolutionaries and join the Labour Party, these gentlemen will expel us." Now, that is something that has happened. Those who have looked at the Labour Party as a vehicle for societal change over this last decade, and especially during the Corbyn era, found themselves expelled without a word of comfort. And now we also have to remember that a big factor in this election is going to be servility towards the Israel lobby and support for genocide in Gaza. But of course, that's not actually new when we look at the history of Labour. Ramsay MacDonald, of course, visited Palestine in 1922 on Ben-Gurion's instructions, and he actually had Ben-Gurion, the future Israeli leader, as his tour guide. They had a great friendship. MacDonald later wrote a letter to Chaim Weizmann pushing a very clear Zionist line in the 1930s. We also have to remember when it comes to this disobedience to the received position of the political elite of the day when it comes to wars, that the founder of the Labour Party, the unfortunate namesake of Mr. Starmer, actually passed away without being mentioned in Parliament simply because he opposed World War I. The mainstream media at the time smeared him as Kerr von Hardy and accused him of being an agent of the German Kaiser. Now, the Labour Party has followed suit again and again, smearing their own leader at a different point with Jeremy Corbyn as an agent of a foreign power. We also have to remember that the shadow, the ghoulish shadow of Tony Blair looms over this election, as you so aptly described it. Now, Blair was a peace envoy to Palestine at the same time as being a patron of the largest Israeli settlement building body in Palestine, the JNF. David Cameron, our current foreign minister, was also a patron of the JNF. You also have to remember that Tony Blair's wife, Sherry Blair, was also an ethical advisor to the Israeli intelligence firm, the NSO Group, that's behind the Pegasus spyware. How can we forget that around 400 phones in this country are believed to have been hacked by the Pegasus spyware, including in the office of Boris Johnson while he was Prime Minister? This sounds like a state that has no respect for its own sovereignty, George. But we also, when thinking about Blair, have to remember that Israel lobbyists were key to his election as Prime Minister through his close relationship with someone I'm sure you'll remember, Mr. Michael Levy. Now, simultaneous to fundraising for Tony Blair, Michael Levy worked as a fundraiser for Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who his son, Daniel Levy, was working for as a justice minister at the time. Now, Blair was first introduced to Levy by the Israeli embassy officer, Gideon Meir. Now, this was at the time when Blair was Shadow Home Secretary. Levy then set about raising for funds for Blair from key Israel lobbyists like Trevor Chin, who today funds Keir Starmer and David Lammy, Emmanuel Kay, who was the head of the Labour Friends of Israel, and even Westfield chairman Frank Lowy, who fought in the Haganah during the Nakba and participated in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, that led to Blair getting elected to stand for Prime Minister and then eventually winning. Now, when in government, Blair strong-armed Michael Levy into a position of influence at the Foreign Office as an unofficial envoy to the Middle East. Levy was accused by Lebanese politicians at the time of advocating the Israeli government position rather than the British government position. But, you know, none of it stops there, George. You even have currently sitting in the unelected House of Lords, where he shapes legislation, John Hutton. Now, Hutton, as you will definitely know and remember, was the Secretary of Defense under Tony Blair. Well, he later went on to work for Lockheed Martin, US arms company, who benefited massively off the war in Iraq. But he now serves as a director of a Rafael subsidiary in Newcastle. Now, Rafael is an Israeli state-owned arms company. So you have somebody in the House of Lords, John Hutton, who currently works for an Israeli state-owned company. I mean, if that is not an attack on sovereignty, I really don't know what is. And you look at the trajectory of Mr. Keir Starmer. This is somebody who, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, he only met with one foreign state prosecutor. That prosecutor was Moshe Lador, the Israeli state prosecutor. And then 2 months later, Starmer blocked the prosecution of Tzipi Livni, the Israeli minister, when she visited this country. And now, in the leadership of the Labour Party, not only has Keir Starmer been funded by Israel lobbyist Trevor Chin, Starmer has even hired a former Israeli spy from Military Intelligence Unit 8200, Asaf Kaplan, to perform the function of social listening in the party. He's also accepted a £5 million donation from Gary Lubner, another key Israel lobbyist. I mean, look at the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle. This was someone that collaborated with Starmer on the plan of sabotage of the ceasefire vote on Gaza. This is somebody so close to Israel that he traveled with Sipi Hotivli there to wax lyrical about his support for Israel in the midst of genocide in Gaza. And he's even previously boasted about his father, MP Doug Hoyle, being one of the founding members of the Israeli embassy proxy, the Labour Friends of Israel. It just doesn't stop there, George. The bottom line is this. If you want to fight back against the Israel lobby in this country, then you will vote for the Workers' Party, you will vote for George Galloway, you will vote for Chris Williamson, and you will push back against Labour wherever you find them.
Yeah, thanks. We're standing hundreds of candidates, as you know, including Chris and myself. And I'm certain that we're going to do very well. I'll give weekly updates on the campaign and would look forward to hearing from you again on that. In the time we have left, though, I want to ask you about the ICJ ruling. It didn't get much coverage here because, frankly, the British have opted out of the ICJ. Not formally, of course. We're founder members of it. We are still members of it. And yet we are openly defying the implications of its rulings. Its first one on the South Africa case, dealing with the plausibility of the charge of genocide, and now this second one, just days ago, demanding an end to the Israeli attack on Rafah. But they are still attacking, still murdering children and women and men in Rafah. And neither of the two British political parties of the so-called mainstream are saying or doing anything about it. So how would you be voting on our poll? Will Israel defy the ICJ ruling on Rafah? And what do you think the world governments, Western governments, will do about that?
Absolutely nothing at all, George. And I will, of course, be voting that the Israeli campaign in Rafah will not be stopped by the ICJ or the ICC. You know, you have to remember that it took the ICC a matter of days to issue arrest warrants for Putin over the operation in Ukraine. Of course, those are completely different situations. The entire world, over 30 countries at least, have armed Ukraine. With the Palestinians, there is only one state power that across the last 30 years has materially supported the Palestinian right to armed resistance, which the entire world, including UN Resolution 3246, recognize. But in the case we are in today, it has taken them this long. And, you know, Karim Khan has demonstrated that he is not fully trustworthy. He's tried to forge, and I mean that in both senses of the word, some form of equivalence between Palestinian resistance and between Israeli genocide. Now, in the case of the ICJ, I think they will definitely ignore it, and it will be a further piece of dirt on the grave of the established order of international law following World War II. And of course, Britain and the United States will support Israel in that horrendous endeavor.
Although not France and even Germany, there does seem to be a breach, albeit a small one, maybe a meaningless one in the end, we'll see. But Macron was the first to say that if Netanyahu came to France, he'd have to be arrested. If Karim Khan, KC, gets his arrest warrant, which hasn't happened yet. Then Germany, to my surprise, said the same thing. Then Ireland, Spain, Norway, all issued these proclamations that they recognized the state of Palestine. Do you see a division opening up in the NATO Western camp, is what I'm asking?
Well, you will also remember in intimate detail, I'm sure, the stands taken by Jacques Chirac over the Iraq War. Obviously, after the war went ahead, unfortunately, the French went along with the campaign, but France has always been seen as a less trustworthy alternative to the British, really, in Europe. So France, we can have some form of hope, especially when we look at French engagement with China too. They seem certainly less hell-bent on the neocon arch towards escalation with China. So I definitely think there are cracks in the monolith, George, and I guess it's our job to make those cracks wider and wider.
Lowkey, you're a superstar, and it's wonderful to have you on the Mother of All talk shows. Come back soon. Thanks for joining us.